In the second week of August 1945, at a compound outside Harbin in occupied Manchuria, a Japanese army general gave the order to destroy everything. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan on the 9th of August, and its armies were moving south faster than anyone had planned for. There were perhaps 3 days, so the engineers laid charges in the buildings, and the staff carried files out into the yard and burned them, and the specimen jars were emptied, and the laboratory animals were killed or released. There were also prisoners in the cells. Somewhere between 150 and 400 people, depending on which account you accept. They were killed, and their bodies were burned in the courtyard, and when the fires were not fast enough, the remains were dumped in a pit and covered. Then the charges were blown, and the general and his senior staff boarded a train south and went home to Japan. It was, on the face of it, one of the most complete acts of evidence destruction in the 20th century. The buildings were rubble. The specimens were ash. The prisoners were dead. The paperwork of 13 years of human experimentation had gone up in smoke in a courtyard in Manchuria. And we have the documents anyway. Not because the destruction failed. It largely succeeded. We have the documents because of what happened 2 years later, in an office in Tokyo, when American officers sat the same men down and asked them to write it all out again, in English for a fee, in exchange for a promise. Transactions generate paperwork. That is the whole of this episode. The crime was successfully erased. The deal to bury it was not, because a deal has to be minuted, justified, cabled to Washington, and approved by somebody senior. It is the same pattern as the receipts that survived MKUltra, and it produces the same result. The people covering something up have to keep records, because concealment inside a bureaucracy is itself a bureaucratic process. To understand how the compound came to exist, you have to go back to a treaty. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol banned the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. It was a response to the gas of the First World War, and it was signed by most of the world's powers. It banned use. It did not ban research. It did not ban development, and it had no inspection regime of any kind. A Japanese army physician named Shiro Ishii read that and drew a conclusion. If the major powers had gone to the trouble of outlawing a weapon, the weapon must be formidable, and a country that developed it while others obeyed the prohibition would hold an advantage that could not be matched. This was not a fringe reading of the treaty. Several countries reached a version of it. Britain, the Soviet Union, and later the United States all ran biological weapons programs on the same logic. What separated Japan's was not the ambition, it was the decision about who the test subjects would be. Ishii was not a marginal figure. He was a trained microbiologist with a doctorate. He had toured laboratories across Europe and North America, and he was persuasive with senior officers. From the early 1930s, he was given money, authority, and something no researcher in Tokyo could have been given. He was given Manchuria. Japan had seized the region in 1931 and installed a puppet state. It was territory under Japanese military control, where Japanese law did not fully apply and where the population had no standing to complain about anything. It offered space, secrecy, and people. The first facility was at Zhongma, near Harbin. After a prisoner escape in 1934, it was abandoned, and a much larger complex was built at Pingfang, a few miles outside the city. Pingfang was enormous. More than 70 buildings across several square kilometers, with its own power plant, its own rail spur, its own airfield, barracks, laboratories, and a block of cells at the center. Thousands of people worked there. Local residents were cleared out of the area and told nothing. The unit's official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. That was not entirely a lie. It did produce water filters, and Ishii's filter design was genuinely used by the Japanese army. The legitimate work was the cover for the rest. And there is one detail that tells you more than any inventory of the buildings. The staff did not refer to the prisoners as prisoners. They called them maruta. It means logs. The story told locally was that the site was a lumber mill and the word stuck, and it became the internal term. Records were kept by number, not by name. That is not slang. It is an instrument. You cannot run a facility like that with a staff of thousands, unless the people working there have a way of not thinking about what is in the cells, and the word was the mechanism. What was done inside is documented, and I am going to be brief about it, because the detail is available elsewhere, and dwelling on it serves nobody. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and other agents, and the progress of the disease was observed to its conclusion. There were frostbite experiments in which limbs were frozen and then thawed by various methods to establish which worked best. There were pressure chamber tests. There were experiments involving deliberate wounding to study battlefield injuries. And there were dissections carried out on people who were still alive, conducted without anesthetic in some accounts, on the reasoning that anesthesia would alter the results. The victims were Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, and Russian. They were prisoners of war, resistance suspects, ordinary civilians picked up in sweeps, and in some cases women and children. Nobody who entered the cell block at Pingfang left it alive. The number who died inside is usually given as around 3,000. There is also evidence that Allied prisoners of war were used in related work, and that remains contested in its detail rather than in its existence. It is worth being clear that this was not the work of a handful of men. Pingfang had a payroll. It had procurement, catering, transport, medical staff, clerks and guards. Thousands of ordinary people went to work there and afterwards went home. And the work did not stay in the laboratory. Ishi's program was not academic. It was weapons development, and the weapons were tested in the field on Chinese cities. Plague-infected fleas were bred in enormous quantities and dropped from aircraft, sometimes mixed with grain or cotton, to slow the fall and attract rats. Water supplies and wells were contaminated. Food was distributed to villages after being infected. Ningbo in 1940. Changde in 1941. Outbreaks of bubonic plague appeared in places that had no history of it, weeks after Japanese aircraft had passed overhead, dropping what witnesses described as debris. The death toll from the field operations is genuinely uncertain. Serious estimates run from the tens of thousands to several 100,000, and the range is that wide because the deaths were disguised as epidemics. In wartime, in a country with no capacity to investigate them, anyone quoting a precise figure is guessing. Then came August 1945, and the courtyard, and the fires. Ishii returned to Japan and, for a period, put out the story that he had died. It did not hold. Because 2 days before General MacArthur landed to begin the American occupation, an officer from the American Biological Warfare Laboratory at Camp Detrick was already in the country, looking for him. He also had something to sell, and he appears to have understood that from the beginning. This is the part that matters, and it needs to be laid out precisely. The United States had known about the program for some time. A captured document describing a Japanese biological bomb had reached MacArthur's staff as early as 1944, and American intelligence held a map of an affiliated unit at Nanjing by the end of that year. The Americans did not stumble on Unit 731. They went looking for it. The first investigator, Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, arrived in the autumn of 1945. A second, Arvo Thompson, followed in 1946. Both got partial accounts. The Japanese scientists admitted to animal research and denied the rest, and the denials held because the Americans had nothing to contradict them with. What changed the negotiation was the Soviet Union. Soviet forces had captured personnel from the unit in Manchuria and wanted the whole matter brought before the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The Japanese scientists understood exactly what that meant, and so did the Americans, and both sides understood something else. Whatever was disclosed at a trial would be disclosed to everybody. Both sides in that negotiation wanted the same outcome for opposite reasons. The Japanese scientists wanted to avoid a rope. The Americans wanted the material and did not want the Soviet Union reading it over their shoulder in open court. So a bargain became possible. In 1947, a third investigator, Norbert Fell, arrived, and the position hardened into an arrangement. Former members of the unit would produce full written reports of their work. They were directed to prepare them. 3 were compiled, covering anthrax, glanders, and plague, and researchers working in the American archives decades later established that they were paid for in cash by American intelligence in Tokyo. In December 1947, 2 more Americans, Edwin Hill of Camp Detrick and Joseph Victor, went to Tokyo to collect the remaining material, including pathological specimens that had been brought back from Manchuria. And then Hill wrote his report, and this is the document. He assessed the material as invaluable. He noted that it could never have been obtained in the United States because of what he called scruples attached to experiments on humans, and he observed that it had been acquired cheaply. That is the sentence that ends the argument. Not that the information was useful, that it was useful, that American law and American conscience made it unobtainable at home, and that the price was low. The reasoning went up the chain in writing. A War Department memorandum in June 1947 laid out the case for avoiding prosecution. The Soviets held only part of the technical picture. A war crimes trial would put all of it into the open for every nation to read, and that publicity was judged contrary to American security interests. MacArthur cabled Washington in May of that year about how much more could be extracted if the Japanese were told the information would be kept in intelligence channels and not used for war crimes. His intelligence chief wrote in July that the material would be of the greatest value to the American biological warfare program. Notice what none of those documents argue. Not one of them claims the men were innocent, or that the accounts were exaggerated, or that there was insufficient evidence to charge. The reasoning is entirely about value and about who else would find out. The decision was made. No member of Unit 731 was prosecuted at the Tokyo Tribunal. The subject was kept out of the proceedings entirely. It is worth holding 2 things in the same frame here. At the moment those memoranda were written, the United States was prosecuting German doctors at Nuremberg for human experimentation and hanging some of them. The Nuremberg Code, the founding document of modern research ethics, which begins by requiring voluntary consent, was handed down in August 1947. The same government, in the same year, was buying the results of the same category of crime in Tokyo and classifying the receipt. The Soviets did prosecute. In December 1949, 12 men were tried at Khabarovsk and convicted. The trial produced sworn testimony describing the program in detail, and it was substantially accurate. In the West, it was dismissed as communist propaganda, and it stayed dismissed for 30 years, partly because it was a Stalinist show trial with all the credibility problems that implies, and partly because the United States had a direct interest in it not being believed. Both of those things are true at once. There is no serious dispute about any of this, and it is not a matter of interpretation. The memoranda exist, in American archives, in plain administrative English. So what happened to the men? Ishii was never charged with anything. He lived in Japan, ran a clinic, and died of throat cancer in 1959. Others returned to ordinary professional life with their careers intact, into university medical faculties, public health administration, and the pharmaceutical industry. One founded a blood products company that became one of Japan's largest, and which decades later was at the center of a scandal over HIV-contaminated blood products. Now the part that makes the whole transaction obscene rather than merely shameful. The data was not worth very much. Fell, the investigator who commissioned the written reports, noted the problem himself. The human results were fragmentary because no experiment had used enough subjects to support a statistically valid conclusion. The work had been done by men who were not constrained by ethics, but were also not producing controlled science. Cruelty is not a methodology. What the United States bought, at the price of letting mass murder go unprosecuted, was a set of incomplete observations of limited practical use. It also did lasting damage of a different kind. A crime that goes unprosecuted stays contested forever. Because there was no trial, no verdict, and no formal record of guilt, the ground was left open for decades of denial, minimization, and argument about whether it happened at all. Getting the truth into public view took decades. The American documents were classified and stayed classified. Japanese official acknowledgement was minimal. The story surfaced in pieces, through Japanese journalists and academics from the 1970s, through an article in an American scientific journal in the early 1980s that drew on declassified material, through a BBC documentary, and through the work of historians in the 1990s who went into the American archives and came out with the memoranda. In 1999, legislation in the United States forced the disclosure of Japanese Imperial Army records held by American agencies alongside the Nazi war crimes disclosure effort. And in 2018, after a long campaign by a Japanese professor, Japan's own National Archives released a roster naming more than 3,500 members of the unit. 73 years after the courtyard fires, the names came out. So here is where it lands. Shiro Ishii destroyed his records, and he did it thoroughly. He burned the files, killed the witnesses in the cells, and leveled the buildings. On the evidence, that part of the plan worked. The original archive of Unit 731 is gone and is not coming back. What he could not destroy was the paperwork of his own immunity. Because the moment the Americans decided to buy his silence rather than prosecute him, the transaction had to be documented. Someone had to request authority. Someone had to justify the cost. Someone had to explain, in writing, to a superior in Washington, why a man who had run a facility that killed thousands of people should not be charged. And the honest answer had to be put down on paper, because a lie would not have survived the approval process. The crime was erased in Manchuria. The reasoning that let it go unpunished was typed, signed, filed, and retained in the United States, and that is what we read now. Everything anyone needed to know was written down, not by the men who did it, by the men who let them go.